Welcome to the Compost Pile, a podcast where we break down gardening, homesteading, and more. Join your hosts, David Poole and Aaron Barnhill, as they pile up information and break it down so that you can be more successful in the garden. Welcome back to the Compost Pile, where we break down all things gardening and homesteading here in Zone 9. I'm your host, David Poole, and today I want to talk about some of the most common midsummer gardening mistakes that we all make, whether we've been doing this for a long time or maybe you're still getting into it, learning the ropes. This episode comes from seeing the same thing happen every single year to so many different people, and I see a lot of things that the average gardener doesn't, being in the retail industry. You know, we hear the same stories over and over and over again, and it drives in that repetition. So at the time that you're listening to this, it's either the very end of June or July. The excitement of spring has really just kind of worn off. Maybe if you're out looking in the garden, the tomatoes are looking really rough. The squash bugs have shown up. The weeds seem to be winning. The leaf-footed stink bugs are all over the place. And many of us, including myself, are starting to look at the beds thinking, well, I guess the season or the year of gardening is over. But here's the thing. In Southeast Texas, gardening is never over. We can always be planning something with proper planning, and in fact, some of the best gardening opportunities of the year are still ahead of us. So let's talk about the mistakes we make this time of year and how we can set ourselves up for success heading into fall. Mistake number one is treating July like the end of the seasoning or the end of the gardening year. This is probably the biggest thing that I see across the board. Most gardeners think of gardening as a spring activity only. So once the tomatoes are done, everything is kind of done, or we're on the tail end. We're over the hill, we're going down, and by midsummer, late summer, we're done with the garden until next spring. We plant in March, April, and May. Things begin to struggle after that, and we kind of mentally check out until next year. But that's not how gardening works in our climate. We're lucky that we actually have the ability to grow year-round. We can grow all these warm season crops twice, in spring and late summer into early fall. And we don't really have a cold season, so we have the opportunity to hit all of those cool weather crops without having to deal with a lot of the extreme cold pressure or shortening our growing year. So ideally, something can be put into our raised beds and into our garden 12 months out of the year. And that's unique. The challenge is that fall gardening starts long before fall weather arrives. While everything is waiting for cooler temperatures, successful gardeners are planning ahead what they're going to do next. Because if we wait until October to think about fall, when fall activities are actually happening, we're already behind. We should have already started seeds. If we're going to do even a second round of warm season crops, we need to be getting certain seeds in the ground right now. We could possibly be even too late. We need tomatoes seeded now so that they're ready for mid to late August. So it's important to take a step back and think about what's coming up and what's coming out of the garden. Those rugged looking tomatoes, the rough looking squash, we might pull those out. Let's make room for something else that we could grow right now, whether it be summer peas, okra. We could still be inputting new herbs if we don't have a lot of herbs in the garden. There's still so many opportunities for things that can handle the hot summer climate. Mistake number two is pulling everything out too soon. Don't get me wrong, some plants are just genuinely done. When I go out and I look at my tomatoes, they've reached the end of their productive life. They might have a few unripened fruit on there, but at the end of the day, I'm tired of waiting. I could better utilize my space for something else, and there's other things that I want, but to each their own. So, looking around, I've already pulled probably half of my tomatoes up, and the rest of them are right behind. I got what I wanted out of them. And there are many crops that might be the case. Maybe you're done with cucumbers. Maybe they're exhausted. Maybe the squash plants have fought a long battle against pests, or maybe you've had some disease issues with the heavy rains that we've gotten. But that doesn't mean everything needs to come out. Things that we might have in our beds from spring, such as peppers and eggplant, they're going to continue to produce into the fall. And oftentimes they might stop producing, but they're hardy enough to handle the hot Texas heat. And then when the temps begin to cool down in fall, we can get a second run without actually having to start over with a new plant. Eggplants are always going to continue performing through the heat. Out of all the nightshade plants that we have here in Zone 9, they tend to handle the most heat and still actually produce. While not everybody has the space for them, sweet potatoes, if you put those in, they're going to grow all throughout the summer. And they're incredibly easy during hot spells. They're very resilient and one of the simplest things that you can plant and be productive with. Keeping herbs like basil, lemongrass, oregano, and rosemary, they'll continue to thrive all throughout this time, and they'll still be ready when fall comes around and we're putting in some of our more delicate crops that have a shorter lifespan. So before you clear an entire bed, take an inventory. Ask yourself what's still producing, what can recover, what is not going to handle the hot summer heat and just needs to go so we're not wasting energy and time and resources on it. And what space do we really need for our upcoming crops, whether it be late summer crops or that next round of warm season crops. Sometimes a little patience pays off, but think about it before you pull it out, unless you know it's just completely done. Mistake number 3, we've kind of already touched on this, but it's not planning for a second round of warm season crops. This is where a lot of people leave a lot of production on the table. You know, spring is so temperamental here in this climate, and that's because the weather is so volatile. We could go through dry spells, we could go through really rainy conditions like we have now, where we see up to 10 inches of rain in a couple hours. All these things are incredible stressors for plants in the spring. And the fall is typically a little more predictable. Not always, but it's a little more predictable. And often it's less stressful for a lot of your warm season crops because instead of growing into the heat, they're growing out of the heat. So few people realize that they can often plant tomatoes again for a fall harvest. So they only think of some of these items as spring crops. Same goes for peppers, cucumbers, squash, beans, and really truthfully, almost any other warm season crop, except maybe okra or purple hull peas. They're not going to like those cool temps on the other side of summer. The timing is different though. You're not planting because the weather's cool. You're planting now so the plants are established before the cool weather arrives. Think about it this way. September and October can be some of our most pleasant gardening months. The problem is that a tomato seed planted in September won't be ready when conditions are ideal. The plants need time to grow beforehand, and that's why fall tomato gardens actually began in July and August. The same principle applies to many warm season vegetables. We've got to have time to germinate seeds when it's warm and get a hardy, healthy plant so that it can handle the cooler temperatures. If you want a productive fall gardening, the planting often starts in the middle of the summer before the first garden in spring is actually finished. Mistake number 4 is waiting too long to start some of those fall crops. This mistake is the opposite of the previous one. Many gardeners, they just really wait for cool weather before planting anything. The challenge is that most of the fall crops need to be started while it's still warm outside. Broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kale, some of your greens, they're often started early on in the fall. They're not necessarily started in summer because things will germinate very quickly here, and They'll bolt and go to seed really, really fast, even when they're young, if the temperatures are too warm. So before we actually reach fall in October and November, where it begins to really see a temperature difference, we're often starting a lot of these seeds, not all, but some, in August and into September. We're getting them ready ahead of the cool temps, making sure that they have time to grow and be established before the cool temps set in and we can actually harvest. These plants rely on the cool temperatures. That helps prevent them from bolting or going to seed, and it helps preserve the best flavor. The calendar and the weather don't always agree. Just because it feels like summer doesn't mean it's too early to begin planning for fall. Successful fall gardens are usually built weeks or even months before people realize it. So think about now, what do you actually use and what do you actually really like that is a cool season crop? Consult a planning guide. We'll try to throw a link in the show notes below to our planning guide, but that varies depending on where you are. Even here in Texas, 15 miles from here, it can vary based on the location we're currently in. Mistake number 5 is ignoring soil improvement opportunities. Summer is a fantastic time to improve your soil. If a bed isn't actively growing something, don't let it sit empty. Add compost, put in some organic matter. Even better, grow a cover crop if it's appropriate or you're not going to be using it for a while. Spread mulch. Work on building up the soil biology and the soil food web. Every improvement you make now pays dividends when fall planting actually begins. One of the biggest advantages you can give yourself is healthy soil before you start your next round of planting. Cover crops are so underrated even as small gardeners. Even if you don't want to plant, or even if you don't like summer crops, planting something like purple hull peas or crowder peas can be immensely beneficial going into fall because they're nitrogen affixers. So they're pulling nitrogen from the atmosphere, storing it in the root system. And when we basically cut these plants and we leave the root systems in the soil, the bacteria is going to begin to go in and break down those nitrogen nodes, and we're feeding and recycling nutrients back into the soil. So think about a lot of your cool season crops and maybe even some of your warm season crops. They're going to need that initial punch of nitrogen to get growing. So just because we don't actually want to use what's planted doesn't mean that we shouldn't put something in that could provide benefit for what's coming later on. Mistake number 6 is chasing perfection instead of learning. We've talked a lot about this here lately. Thinking about starting small, making sure that things are sustainable to a point where we can actually take care of it and that we can actually learn. Every mistake that we make is going to come with a lesson that is going to teach us something that will prevent us from making the same mistakes over and over. And it gives us a way to strengthen our skills as gardeners. Every gardener has successes and failures. Maybe your tomatoes struggled this year. Maybe your onions weren't what you hoped for. Mine definitely were not, but I know what I did wrong by really sitting down and thinking about what happened and what I did, what I didn't do, and I have a better game plan for next season. Maybe the insects found your garden before you did. That's been a huge issue this year in 2026. The pests just seem to be rampant. Not seeing a lot of bee pollination like I did the previous year, but I'm seeing lots of pests. This is the first year we've actually encountered leaf-footed stink bugs in this garden where it became an issue with tomatoes. And that's interesting. So I'm trying to see what might have influenced that to happen that didn't occur in previous years. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is observation. I know we talk about this a lot on this show, but repetition for me is key, and it's what keeps me moving forward and learning and ensuring that we're able to correct the mistakes that we make in our own home garden. We're looking at what worked. We're looking at what failed. Look at what varieties handled the heat. Look at which flowers actually attracted pollinators. I think about how I haven't seen a lot of certain types of pollinators, but maybe I just don't have the right set of flowering plants that is drawing them, or maybe I just don't have enough of them. So I'm thinking about those things and how I can alter the setup, how I can add or change to fix these things. Look at which beds drained well, which ones stayed soggy or held water, so that you know how to make changes to have better growth, healthier plants, and less problems. These observations become kind of your roadmap for the next season, and I think you should definitely take the opportunity to write it down, maybe record some audio, just find ways to document what worked and what didn't, because it's really hard to remember what happened in the same space a couple years ago. Maybe not everybody feels that way, but I know I do. There's just so much happening all the time. It's just hard to retain it all. Looking ahead for fall, that's what kind of gets me excited this time of year. While many people are winding down, gardeners have another opportunity coming. We're about to enter a period where we can grow another round of tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, beans, squash, and who knows what else. Soon after that, we'll transition into the cole crops and root crops of onions and carrots, lettuce, spinach, and whatever is good for you. The southern part of Texas, mustard and collard greens are always a huge staple. Purple top turnips, they're massively grown. The next few months are really about to overlap, so it's important to think ahead, because the opportunity to grow so much and harvest so much is there, but we only have so much space. So if we're not planning ahead and utilizing our space for those overlaps, then we're underutilizing our garden, or we're not getting as much out of it as we could, and really bringing in the value from growing your own food. You're finishing summer while preparing for the fall. You're evaluating what worked while making room for what's next. And in a lot of ways, the decisions you make now determine how successful the fall season is going to be. So if your garden isn't looking perfect right now, don't worry. July and the finish line, it's kind of like halftime. There's still plenty of growing season, or growing year for me here in Southeast Texas. It's time to kind of evaluate, improve your soil, plan your next plantings, start thinking about fall before everyone else does, because before long, we'll be talking about fall vegetables, that second round of tomatoes, and the cool mornings that we all look forward to after this ridiculously hot summer that we're already in. Just a reminder, nothing's ever going to be perfect. Learn from everything that happens in your space and just keep growing. Thanks for tuning in to the Compost Pile. Until next time, catch you then.